Sæl hlustendur og velkomin í nýjan þáttaræðana Ekon, hlaðvarpum hinn ýmsu viðfangsefni hagfræðinnar. Ég þáttastjórnandi ykkar Emil Dagsson. Í þessum þætti verður fjallað nýjan mælikvarða á efnahagslegri velferð fyrir Ísland. Mælikvarðinn sem almennt notaður í dag fyrir efnahagslega velferð hagvaxtur, en það orð yfir breytingu á vergri þjóðarframleiðslu milli ára. Nýji mælikvarðinn sem verður fjallað hér á eftir horfir til fleiri þátta en hagvöxtur og gerir einkum ráð fyrir umhverfisáhrifum. Slíkur mælikvarði heitir á ensku Genuine Progress Indicator en á íslensku einfaldlega framfarastuðull. Til ræðum þetta kominn hann David Cook, nýdoktor og lektor í umhverfis- og auðlindafræði við Háskóla Íslands. Hann ásamt Brynhildi Davíðsdóttir bjuggu eða aðlöguðu þennan mælikvarða fyrir Ísland og skrifuðu það fræðigrein sem kom út árið 2021. Ólíkt öðrum þáttum verður þessi þáttur alfarið á ensku, þar sem David Cook frá Bretlandi. Hi David, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
No, thanks for coming and discussing your works on the Genuine Progress Indicator. So for the start with the first question, you're a postdoctorate and a lecturer at the Department of Environmental and Natural Resources, where your field of research, correct me if I'm wrong, has mainly been focused on sustainability, pollution, and economic sides of climate change. What drove you and Davíðsdóttir to create or adjust the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, for Iceland?
Yes, sure. So I am a postdoctoral researcher, part of the Faculty of Economics here at the University of Iceland, and also a lecturer in environmental economics. And over the last 2 to 3 years, most of my research is focused on a project called Sustainable Economic Development for Iceland. And it has focused on a few issues. Yes, climate change to a degree, but it's focused mostly on the topic of economic well-being, indicators of measurement in relation to that, and also sustainable energy development. And over sort of the lifespan of this project, the topic of the well-being economy has become one of the main objectives of the Icelandic coalition government. I would say they're probably one of the leading members of what's called the WeGo partnership. That's a small coalition of governments that are trying to place economic well-being rather than just simply the size of economic activity as the primary goal of policymakers. So coming to why we actually focus on the Genuine Progress Indicator for Iceland, if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, this is something that has been recognized, not specifically the Genuine Progress Indicator, but a need to develop complementary measures of economic progress to GDP, or gross domestic product. So if you look into the goals and the targets of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see something of a sort of a contradictory set of objectives in there. So you can look at Goal 7, which has a target for nations to maintain rates of economic growth in line with national specificities. So obviously growth focused, GDP focused. But we can also look at the final target of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is number 19 of Goal 17. And this says that we need to embrace complementary measures of progress to gross domestic product. So it's kind of almost a contradiction, or recognizing that we need to go a bit further in terms of actually measuring economic progress, ways that go beyond some of the shortcomings of gross domestic product that I'm sure we'll get onto. So in some ways, Iceland is actually doing this through well-being economy indicators. It has its set of 39 indicators that it adopted a couple of years ago, which are largely quantitative measures of progress, especially of issues to do with sustainability. But on the other hand, these indicators don't provide any sort of monetary assessment of progress that goes beyond the shortcomings of GDP. So that's where alternative measures of economic well-being come in on the macro scale. The Genuine Progress Indicator is one. there are many others. There's the genuine savings index. Before that was the measure of economic welfare. There's the inclusive wealth index, and so on. There are countless actual examples of alternative measures of economic welfare. We choose to focus, though, on the genuine progress indicator because it is, in our view, the most comprehensive measure of progress in terms of its scope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you maybe already answered my second question, which is on like why countries should look to the GPI instead of the GDP. Well, which you kind of got into, which is.
Well, I mean, I can maybe provide a bit more detail.
Yeah, sure.
In that regard, because I mean, really, to understand this, you have to understand some of the history of the gross domestic product as an indicator, why it was used, what it is used for, and then begin to understand its weaknesses and shortcomings. So gross domestic product, it was first developed by an American economist called Simon Kuznets in the period after the Great Depression from about 1929 to 1935, and he was focused on the American economy. But it became a more standardized and widely adopted measure in the period after World War II. So this actually made a lot of sense at the time, because after World War II, we had the Marshall Plan, which was the program for rebuilding the world after the damage of World War II. So economic welfare was very much tied at that point to how much economic activity was going on. Then it started to become more standardized through the publication of something called the System of National Accounts. That was in, I think it was in 1953, and this has been revised over time. It's now a vast 700-page or so manual on how to record and aggregate economic activities. If you look at GDP today, there are GDP figures published for, I think, 200 of the world's nations. Almost everyone is in the United Nations statistical databases and reporting GDP, at least on an annual basis. And then this data is then further used by organizations such as the OECD, the European Commission, other organizations as well, the IMF. And then you have geopolitical bodies, for instance, the G7, the G20, and these are actually organized on the basis of a nation's GDP ranking. You then have the usage of GDP data by economists, both in academic research and modelers in the formation of projections about how economies will go in the future. You have stockbrokers using GDP data for investment decisions. You have GDP data forming part of the calculation for social progress measures such as the Human Development Index. GDP is widely used. It's almost, I suppose you could say it's a bit like a multinational company. So it's developed and it has this worldwide presence. It has this vast logistical infrastructure that reinforces its importance, has this harmonized methodology through the System of National Accounts. There are quality control procedures in place. And of course, in some ways, use of GDP makes great sense for measuring economic progress. It is important to know how much economic activity is going on. Of course, it's like a ticking taximeter of economic activity. It's a measure of overall economic health. And if we have falling or stagnant GDP, this tends to mean rising unemployment, falling tax revenues. Same time, the welfare bill tends to go up. Our standard of life is typically falling. So those are some of the reasons why GDP has become sort of embedded and embraced and widely used as this measure of economic progress. But then we also have to recognize some of the limitations of GDP, some of which were actually recognized by Simon Kuznets, the initiator of GDP. Firstly, I mean, it's often used as this comparison of economic well-being between nations, but this is quite dangerous because the quality of data that is used for the GDP calculation varies greatly across the planet. Then you have a bigger problem, and that's that GDP is often used as this measure of economic well-being or social well-being even, and it doesn't actually measure that. It also doesn't measure anything to do with the distribution of income, inequality, in other words. It also does nothing to measure about the sustainability of economic activity. So at the very least, at best, I would say it's a proxy measure of economic welfare. This idea that the size of an economy is a good proxy makes some sense because, of course, there is, I would say, and evidenced, there is a strong correlation between the size of a nation's economy and standard of life, especially in developed nations where there tend to be developed welfare states, strong investment in education and health and that kind of thing. But this kind of relationship between the size of an economy and economic well-being only actually works up to a certain point. There are a lot of things that are included in GDP as an activity that we might actually be considered to be quite bad. So if, for instance, there's a pollution event, let's say there's an oil spill on an Icelandic beach somewhere, then that economic activity that led to the oil spill, that counts in GDP as a positive, and so do the costs of the cleanup. As I said, GDP is just this measure of how much is going on. If a nation is sustaining its economic activities by exporting arms and munitions, then that's considered to be a credit, not a debit in GDP. If a nation's economy is heavily reliant on the use of fossil fuels, then those economic activities are also positives in GDP. So many people, including economists actually, would say we should be considering quite carefully about whether economic activities are really contributing to our welfare, or are they actually, to some extent at least, undermining it. What's more, there are activities that actually contribute to our well-being that are not picked up by GDP, are not represented by market transactions. So things like the value of work that we do in our home, our leisure time, our voluntary work, the contribution of nature through ecosystem services to our well-being, and so on. There are many things that have no market transaction linked to them that are not picked up as an activity in GDP. So based on all of that, you can come to the conclusion that yes, we need GDP as this measure of activity, but we also need, in addition, not as necessarily as a replacement to GDP, but in addition, we need these complementary measures of progress, such as the genuine progress indicator that seek to correct for some of those flaws and anomalies.
So, as I understand it, the GPI is calculated using utility or utility functions. There are some activities, as you pointed out before, that increases utility and therefore the GPI, and then there are some actions that contribute to this so-called disutility. And therefore those activities decrease the GPI. So can you maybe tell me a bit about what is considered good utility and what is considered disutility or bad utility?
Sure. Well, let me just maybe in more detail explain the methodology that underpins the genuine progress indicator. So, sure. As you said, the GPI recognizes that there are certain market-based activities that give us utility benefits, and there are those that cause us some harm, or what we could call disutility. And over the years, there have been different approaches to calculating the GPI, but we use in the Icelandic study, we use something called the GPI-2 method that was first published in the year 2017 by Talbot and Weisdorf. And this has three core components that are then aggregated. So the first core component is the utility that is gained from goods and services. So it starts from the assumption that all consumption is good for us. So the aggregate consumption value from gross domestic product is taken. Normally, this constitutes about 60 to 65% of the total value of GDP, roughly. Then in this core component, there are some adjustments that are made. So these include deductions for defensive and regrettable expenditures. So things we buy that are actually bad for us, alcohol, drugs, for instance, insurance, things we take out to prevent or mitigate risk. Then makes a further adjustment for income inequality with reference to the Gini coefficient. It then adds in investments in public service provisions such as healthcare and education. So that's the first core component. We then have a second core component, which is an aggregation of the utility benefits that we get from essential capital stocks in a nation. So that includes human capital, so our skills and knowledge, built capital, our social capital, and also natural capital And with regards to the latter, that links to the ecosystem services benefits that we get from nature. So that's just typically an addition. But then we have the third core component, and this is often, well, almost always will be a deduction in the aggregation, which are the environmental and social costs of economic activity. So you might consider these to be akin to the externalities of economic activity, the environmental and social externalities. So they include things such as the damages of pollution to our well-being, greenhouse gas emissions, the drawing down of non-renewable resources, such as use of fossil fuels. On the social side, the costs of crime, the costs of commuting, and so on. There is always a bit of a debate about what should and should not be included in the GPI. But for the Icelandic study that we published last year, we included 39 components linked to those three core categories that I mentioned. So that's actually quite good. So if you look at the some other recent national examples, such as the GPI studies for Australia or New Zealand, they have less than 30 components. Even so, in the Icelandic case, there are things that we might say are missing. So, for instance, we don't have any cost value in there for soil erosion. Iceland has the highest rates of soil erosion in Europe. Some of it is natural, but a significant proportion can probably be attributed to man-made economic activities such as overgrazing. So we don't yet have a method for calculating those costs. It's something that we would hopefully add later. It's research that we have ongoing. So yeah, there's a bit of a debate about what should and should not be in there and how some of these things are calculated. But in terms of the core structure, that is, as I've just outlined to you.
Okay, yeah, so also I found it interesting that in the paper, which covers the period from the year 2000-2019, the annual GDP and GPI per capita both reduced in four different occasions. Yeah. Those are, however, not the same occasions for the GDP and GPI. For instance, the annual GDP per capita increased in 2019, while the GPI fell. Can you explain to me why that is?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it kind of links to what I've just said in the sense that they're not actually measuring the same things. So maybe it's best to sort of explain this first by just a simple example. So obviously there have been activities in Iceland over the last 20, 30 years that have led to expansion in gross domestic product. We've seen the introduction of aluminium smelters, for instance. We've seen considerable economic growth that you could probably attribute to the expansion in the tourism sector. So that leads, of course, to an increase in GDP, and to some extent, it leads to an increase in the GPI. However, of course, that third component in the GPI, those environmental and social costs, that is not included in GDP. So as we've seen those smelters increasing, as we've seen expansion in the scale of the tourism industry in Iceland, we have, for instance, seen considerable expansion in greenhouse gas emissions linked to those activities, especially in the case of the aluminium smelters. So that has increased those environmental costs, and therefore the GPI correspondingly would go down with respect to that. So it doesn't actually make necessarily sense for GDP and GPI growth to actually go exactly in tandem. In fact, probably very often we would see the opposite. So coming back to your specific point about the year 2019, the GDP and the Icelandic GPI, they both actually reached their peak in 2019 as an absolute value. But it was indeed the per capita statistics that varied. So GDP per capita, I think, was highest in 2019, but for the GPI, it was the year before. And the main reason the GPI per capita was slightly lower in 2019 than 2018 was because there was an increase in environmental and social costs in 2019, most of which could be attributed to increased costs of commuting in 2019 compared to 2018. The difference, though, between 2019 and 2018 per capita was not actually very large at all. It was just a tiny reduction. And as I say, the GPI overall still increased in 2019 compared to 2018.
Okay, I see. So, but what about, because the time of the time, so 2008 and 2009 are both in the period you're analyzing. The big years for GDP, of course, and the GPI. How do these two measurements differ in measuring the turbulence at that time?
Yeah, so this is actually quite interesting because the turbulent effects of that economic crisis are actually both showing up in GDP and the GPI, but to a more significant extent in GDP. So for reasons which I will try and briefly explain. So obviously the 2008 financial collapse, the banking crisis, was a huge event in Iceland, and the ramifications were felt for several years. Our assessment in this study is based on the period 2000 to 2019. So if we first of all just look at the period 2000 to 2007, and we look at GDP, that increased year on year, no economic contraction at all. Then there's the banking crisis. So GDP declined in 2008, 2009, and 2010. And overall, by 2010, it had declined by just over 10%. What's interesting is that it didn't actually then recover until its 2008 level in real terms until 2015. So really, it was a 7-year hit that the Icelandic economy experienced. And it was only really when the nation's tourism boom was in full swing that you got back to the economic level that you were at in 2008. So that's how the GDP picture played out. Now, if you look at the GPI, its pattern was quite similar, but not so severe. So if we look first of all again at the GPI from the period 2000 up until 2008, it also increased year on year. Then we had this decline in 2009 of about 7%, and it only returned to its 2008 level in real terms in 2013. But remember that the GDP statistic only returned to its previous level in 2015. So that was 2 years sooner in the case of the GPI. So you might ask, why is this?
Why is that?
Why does the GPI actually return to its previous level more quickly? And there were really two main and quite simple explanations. So the economic crisis and collapse in 2008 reduced income inequality. So that deduction that I mentioned in relation to the first core component of the GPI, that deduction for income inequality actually reduced. Hence, costs reduced. So the GPI does not go down as much because of that. Then also, at the same time, there were reduced and environmental and social costs over that period. So what we're basically saying is that the debits in the GPI were less as a consequence of that financial collapse. There were some things we might say actually improved as a consequence of the financial crisis.
Oh, this is very interesting. Another thing I found really interesting about the paper is that you say that in contrast to other countries, the GDP in Iceland might be undervaluing economic welfare by as much as, you state here, that as much as a multiplier of 2.42 or almost 3 times. How is that?
Yeah, so this requires some explanation in terms of the methodology. It's really one of the key parts of our study. So if you look at many existing GPI studies, they will show a GPI value that is typically less than GDP. That's because of mostly because of these environmental and social costs. But we were basing our GPI study on this version 2 method, the one by Talbot and Weisdorf. And this includes the value of ecosystem services. So this is what has typically been omitted from earlier GPI studies. And this makes an absolutely critical difference to the outcome. So
what is that exactly? Sorry.
So just to put that into some sort of context,
Mm-hmm.
we have conducted another study in which we estimate the value of Iceland's ecosystem services using something called the benefit transfer method. It is admittedly a fairly crude method for approximating the economic value of Iceland's ecosystem services.
Mm-hmm.
And what we find is that this value, even though we omit many ecosystem services, such as the cultural dimension of ecosystem services, we find that this value is equal to approximately 108% of Iceland's GDP in the year 2019. So if you factor that in and recognize that this is an addition to the GPI, that explains why it is always so much more than GDP. As you said, multiples of 2.42 to 3.05 of GDP. But actually this, to some extent, can obscure other key outcomes from the study. So when people see that the GPI is higher than GDP, they might think Iceland is actually doing fantastically in terms of its economic welfare. But you also have to look at those environmental and social costs. Those cannot be ignored. So one of the other things that we report in the study, and it actually is in the abstract, is that those environmental and social costs amount to between 18 and 25% of the value of consumption. And remember, I said that the value of consumption is roughly 60 to 65% of Iceland's GDP. So 18 to 25% of that is a considerable amount. So it's quite a considerable deduction. So if that deduction was, of course, to be reduced, then, of course, Iceland's GPI would be higher. And when we highlight these costs to do with things such as greenhouse gas emissions, non-renewable resource depletion, and all of that, what we're really doing is reinforcing the importance of Iceland continuing on its pathway of decarbonisation. So you have the net zero target for 2040. You have the objective of the Icelandic government to phase out all fossil fuel consumption by 2050. So it means further decarbonisation. It means further investment in public transportation infrastructure, especially, of course, in Reykjavik. It means rolling out of electric cars, expanding carbon capture and storage, reducing fossil fuel consumption in the maritime sector, reducing reliance on the private car for non-essential journeys. It means all of those things. Those will be ways of actually boosting Iceland's GPI score.
So what would you consider to be the biggest contributor towards like this utility or in Iceland? Where can Iceland improve?
Sure. I mean, I suppose I partially just answered that by accident. But if you look at the social costs, the biggest contributors are the cost of unemployment and the cost of commuting. Now, obviously, our study ended in 2019, but thereafter, due to the pandemic, the cost of unemployment would have gone up and been very high. If we look at the costs with regards to the environment, then we're talking about the costs of air pollution, particularly things like particulate matter in the city of Reykjavik, and also the costs of greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously, to some extent, the costs of commuting and particulate matter are somewhat aligned, because so much of the particulate matter that is produced in Reykjavik is linked to sort of studded tires and erosion and that kind of thing. But also there, of course, Iceland has one of the highest rates of car ownership in the world. I mean, if you look at Iceland on a per capita basis, it actually has the second highest rates of car ownership in the world, above even the United States. Oh, so despite the increase in sort of purchases of electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, much of that existing car fleet is quite intensive in terms of fossil fuel consumption. It's going to be around for quite a few years yet. So there are challenges there to be overcome, ways of actually reducing Iceland's environmental costs that would boost the GPI.
So the GPI is, as you pointed out earlier, is a part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and is being implemented globally, to my understanding. So, to your knowledge, is there any work being done here in Iceland now to implement this measure, using it for public policy, for instance?
Well, just to add one thing on what you said, I mean, the GPI has been conducted, and I think about 55, 60 countries. Admittedly, that has been mostly the developed nations. There have been far fewer studies in a developing context. But with regards to Iceland, as far as I know, there are no efforts currently being made in Iceland to implement the genuine progress indicator. But this is quite interesting because if you remember back to the last election, which wasn't so many months ago in Iceland, there was quite a bit of talk going on about how Iceland needed to develop alternative measures of economic progress to GDP. So this has actually been a part of the Icelandic discourse for quite a while. You can go back to a government policy document called Iceland 2020. It was published about a decade ago. And in that, there was an objective that was set that was for Iceland's genuine progress indicator to always remain on a level with growth in GDP. That's quite interesting because it implies that you actually have to calculate it in order to know this. But nothing was done in the period thereafter. So I would say, I mean, that there is a need for this to be done. More recently, as I said at the beginning of our chat, there has been focus in Iceland on these well-being economy indicators, which were published a couple of years ago. And these are essentially measures of the sustainability impacts of economic activity. But they don't provide this alternative aggregate measure of progress in monetary terms that corrects for the shortcoming of GDP. So hopefully, maybe based on this pilot study of the GPI for Iceland, it could be used. And it would also be very interesting to look into some of the impacts in the GPI of the pandemic in the years 2020 and 2021.
Yes, it would be, and hopefully we can start measuring this regularly and making it as a part of public policy here in Iceland. So thank you for coming on the show. Maybe and discussing your paper on the GPI. Just a short question to finish. What's next for you, David?
Okay, well, thank you again for having me. So my postdoctoral research project, it continues. So part of my recent work is involved looking at some of the conceptual consistency between the well-being economy as a sort of a theoretical construct, and actually how this is playing out in terms of the indicators that are selected for well-being economy evaluation. So I've been looking at the well-being economy sets of some of the vanguard nations in this regard, so Iceland, Scotland, New Zealand, and I've been looking at the extent to which those indicator sets actually really represent the concept. So that work is ongoing. And then, as I just said, another task that I hope to commence in the period sort of September to up to the Christmas time is to actually look at the impacts of the COVID pandemic and how that affected both Iceland's GDP. Of course, we know that contracted, but how did it also affect Iceland's GPI? So at the very least, I would say that it's probably possible to do this for 2020. Sometimes there was time lags on things like environmental data that might prevent a 2021 assessment at this point. And it's going to be very interesting to see how Iceland's GPI actually reacts to that crisis. So at the time, to sort of offset some of the contraction in consumption, the government were investing considerably in sort of the public provision of services and education. So would that be sufficient to offset some of the contraction? Then we have the question, were environmental and social costs actually reduced due to the need to be home much more than usual? Did the cost of commuting reduce, for instance? Was income inequality down, as was the case after the 2008 financial collapse? So these are all interesting things for me to explore. And as far as I'm aware, nobody to date has actually looked into the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on an alternative measure of economic welfare. So it would be maybe unique in that regard.
That's very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing your results in the future on these topics. So thank you again, and thank you, listener, for listening.